Good morning, everyone. I am Tony Vernetti, the president and founder of FEDS, Federal Employee Defense Services. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar on liability insurance for USAID employees, both those in the Foreign Service and GS, and certainly the personal service contractors. All this information will be relevant for all of you. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about myself. I am a former federal employee. Also, I was an attorney at a federal law enforcement agency for many years, and then I worked many years at my old law firm, Shaw, Bransford, and Roth, where I was a partner, and defended federal officials at a variety of agencies, to include USAID and state employees and the Foreign Service and DSS and other GS employees. We have a lot of information to get through today, so we're going to ask you to hold your questions until the end, and then I promise we'll stay on as long as necessary to get all your questions answered. I should also mention that I know that people are having a little bit difficulty logging on or getting kicked off. We will be recording the webcast today, so if you missed any portion of it, we'll be able to send out a recording of it, and you could listen to it later as well. So our goal today is to tell you about your administrative, civil, and criminal exposures that you face as a federal employee, about the professional and financial risks associated with your federal employment, what to do upon the notification of any type of claim, inquiry, or investigation, and then how professional liability insurance works and the coverage that it provides. I should also mention that I'm going to be providing this information from the focus of what FEDS provides, our liability insurance provides, but our main goal here is to really just educate you on what your professional exposures are and how the liability insurance works. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, in the interest of full disclosure, that there are two other companies, main companies, that also provide liability insurance, and I would invite you to check them out as well before you make your decision on which liability insurance policy you'd like to choose from. So the liability exposure for all federal employees really began back in June of 1971 with this Supreme Court decision, Bivens versus 6 unknown federal narcotics agents. And really the facts of the underlying case happened back in 1967. Essentially, Mr. Bivens was arrested by the federal narcotics agents, which essentially was a precursor to DEA, hauled out of his home in the middle of the night, out in the middle of the street, big commotion, got him to the jailhouse, realized they had the wrong guy. So he sued, and he sued the agents personally, and this was the very first time that the Supreme Court rendered a decision that concluded that federal employees can actually be sued personally for doing their job. This is not law school, so I'm not going to get into any real big complicated legal analysis. All you need to know is that you as a federal employee can be sued personally, and you can be liable for monetary damages. Okay? You do not have absolute immunity for these types of lawsuits like you do for lawsuits under the Federal Tort Claims Act. You only have what's called qualified immunity, which is still pretty darn good. Essentially, that means that you will not be held liable if you had a good faith belief that your actions were legal and your belief was a reasonable one. But because there is this possibility that federal officials could be liable for doing his or her job, the concept, the idea for liability insurance came about, and it's also the whole reason that Congress passed special legislation in response to this ruling requiring federal executive branch agencies to reimburse federal managers, supervisors, and law enforcement officers up to half a really important point. Congress understands that you need this protection. They want you to have this protection, so they want to share the burden of the cost with you. It cannot be emphasized enough, because Congress truly appreciated that federal employees in these groups needed this kind of protection to have peace of mind to do their jobs. I should also mention that liability insurance is available to all federal employees. You do not need to be in this particular group. It is only these groups that Congress has authorized as required agencies to reimburse. It doesn't mean if you're not within one of the groups, doesn't mean that you still don't need it, and it doesn't mean that it's still not very affordable, because it is. It just means that Congress, in all their infinite wisdom, has decided on these specific groups. If you have any questions about whether you're eligible for the reimbursement, your agency's policy can be found on your intranet. It's Chapter 537 on professional liability insurance, and it expands the reimbursement definition a bit to cover COTARs, contracting officers who have to file their public financial disclosure form. So if you're required to file the 404, I believe it is, and you are in one of those types of positions, you're going to be eligible for the reimbursement. Bottom line, look at Chapter 537. If you email us, we have a copy after the webcast. We'll be happy to send it to you. If you have any questions, just go to HR, and they'll tell you whether you're eligible for the 50% reimbursement. Given the enormous responsibility of the USAID mission, it's impossible to identify each and every position that should get liability insurance, but if we had to articulate some of these categories, it would be the groups of employees that you see here on the screen. Now, depending upon the nature of your work, your primary liability exposure may be a bit different. For example, those in law enforcement, those who protect our national secrets, intelligence community. You all may be primarily concerned with civil or criminal liability exposure. Those who manage or supervise federal employees, make decisions on public policy, financial stuff, contracting, medical. You may be primarily concerned with administrative investigations. So you want to think of your professional exposures in terms of these three categories: civil, which is your pocketbook, administrative and disciplinary, and then finally criminal. We're going to start out with talking a little bit about your civil exposures. These civil suits are often referred to as Bivens actions, constitutional torts, personal capacity, or individual capacity lawsuits. And they generally involve some fairly complicated legal principles. But for purposes of today's discussion, the takeaway, what I want you to take away is an understanding and an appreciation that you can be denied DOJ representation and that you can be held personally liable even if the Department of Justice is representing you. Again, you do not have absolute immunity for these personal capacity lawsuits like you do for lawsuits under the Federal Tort Claims Act. And as I said, DOJ representation is not mandatory and it is not automatic. So the Fed's policy will appoint you an attorney to defend in these personal capacity lawsuits when DOJ exercises its discretion not to defend you in a lawsuit. When does that happen? That most often happens if you're being investigated for some sort of wrongdoing for the very same reason that you are being sued. You could see that the Department of Justice will not want to be on both sides of that. It's a two-part test. Are you within the scope of your employment, which is usually yes, and then is it in the interest of the United States to represent you? And if DOJ says no, that's when the policy will kick in for representation purposes. If DOJ does represent you and they lose, and there's a personal judgment, and your agency does not indemnify, the Fed's policy will provide indemnity protection up to the $1 million or $2 million limits. I should also mention that if DOJ is on the fence as to whether they will represent you or not, we will hire what's called coverage counsel to go in there and try to convince DOJ that it is in the interest of the United States to represent you, because at the end of the day, we're all better off if the United States government stands up in court for you and says that they are representing you. Also, in certain types of other very sensitive cases where we think there's a potential, a remote possibility for liability, we may appoint coverage counsel to just kind of oversee DOJ's representation of you. Here are some real-world examples where civil lawsuits have resulted against federal employees who were simply just doing their job. A recent one that I don't have up here that I would like to mention because I think it touches upon a variety of points is the case of ATF agent Will Clark down in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Will was a special agent for ATF, so he had authority to be armed 24/7. One Sunday morning he was going to the gym, and a neighbor came running over to him, being a clear victim of some bad domestic violence. So my boyfriend's trying to kill me. The boyfriend attacks both of them. Special Agent Clark draws his weapon, fatally wounds the boyfriend, kills him. Lo and behold, he's in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The locals actually prosecuted him for murder. The courts there decided that they came in and argued the supremacy clause to have the case dismissed or at least transferred outside of Virgin Islands. They rendered a decision that the Constitution does not follow the flag, every provision of it, so the supremacy clause did not apply in that case, and Will actually had to go through a criminal prosecution, which he was acquitted for. He was then later sued personally, and he won jury trial there, justifiable use of force. The point I want to make is while DOJ did provide representation for Special Agent Clark on both cases, the criminal one and the civil one, it could have gone either way. It was really, really, really a close determination. So if Will had the Fed's policy, he would have had the security to know that his criminal legal defense would have been paid for by us, and the civil defense would have been paid for by us, and God forbid if there was a judgment, it would have been paid for by us as well. So just a real quick recap of civil. What you need to understand, what I want you to take away, is that you can be sued personally and you can be held liable for a judgment. DOJ can deny representation. Again, it is the sole discretion of DOJ to decide whether you will be assigned a DOJ attorney to defend you. Even if it's absolutely clear that you were acting within the scope of your employment, DOJ must also determine that it is in the interest of the United States to provide you with defense counsel. Okay? And again, the Fed's policy will protect you and provide protection in these three major ways: legal defense, coverage counsel, and pays damages. A final point I want to make before we leave civil is that civil suits without DOJ representation are rare. Okay? With actual liability being even rarer. You're probably talking about less than 5% of the cases. But it can happen. It does happen. The exposure is there. So for as little as $145 a year, which is what all you will learn the policy costs if you get reimbursed, why would you risk it? Why would you want to be one of the ones that slips through the cracks? Next, we're going to talk about administrative coverage, which is really where we see the liability insurance being used the most. It's your biggest bang for your buck. It's where we really see the most usage of it. So whether it's a response to a major incident, some sort of alleged wrongdoing involving a common everyday function, if it's perceived that you or your agency has failed in its mission in any way, you can be certain that there will be a demand of accountability. That's the name of the game, accountability these days. And these accountability demands take the form of certain kinds of investigations. Office of Inspector General investigations, DS investigations, Office of Security, Congressional, any HR management investigations. If there is a finding of wrongdoing, it can result in a disciplinary action that may be grieved to the Forest Service Grievance Board or file an appeal with the MSPB. So the Fed's policy will provide coverage for any of these administrative matter, any kinds of these investigations that could result in a personnel action against you. The Fed's policy will appoint you your own attorney up to $200,000 of legal fees to defend from what I call cradle to grave, from the start of any investigation all the way up to any conclusion. And in the unfortunate event that there's a disciplinary action taken against you, the Fed's policy will also defend, both at the agency level and at any appellate level, whether if you're in the Foreign Service through the grievance process or if you're a GS employee through the MSPB. Here are just some basic common allegations of wrongdoing that we've seen. Just yesterday, for example, I was reading where Russia accused USAID of covertly influencing the country's politics and elections. Whenever we see something with that kind of severe media sensation, for example, you can bet your bottom dollar that the agency's going to look into it. They're going to go out there and investigate. Whenever there are these allegations of wrongdoing, if for no other reason than to provide transparency or to clear the federal official of any wrongdoing, they're going to look into these types of allegations. You should expect investigations if you're involved in any major event that involves any safety concerns, public alarm, injury, death, oversight, monetary loss. That's big in a lot of the public programs that you're responsible for enforcing. Terrorism, vulnerability, breach, any type of failure that could result in a need for legal counsel. The Fed's policy will provide you an attorney in any one of these types of investigations to defend against the allegations, to prepare you for the administrative or investigative process, which is huge, attend the investigative interview with you if they are allowed. It's discretionary, as most agencies at the IG level, DS, they typically do let representatives in, and obviously defend you in any resulting disciplinary action, both at the agency administrative level and or at the MSPB. I want to just take a moment and provide you a little bit more information about these so-called integrity investigations that will involve the Office of Inspector General, Diplomatic Security, Office of Security, because the consequences, the fallout, the results from these investigations can be very, very serious, resulting in some serious actions against you, some serious job actions. I can't tell you how many times I have heard, I didn't do anything wrong, and if I did, I could just show up and explain. Or if I show up with a lawyer, they're going to think I'm guilty. I can't tell you how many times, I've heard that, and somebody applying those concepts on their own without getting the benefit of legal advice usually do not fare very, very well. These entities, particularly the OIG, which investigates fraud, waste, and abuse and employee misconduct, they like making cases against federal officials. And the bigger the federal official, or federal fish as I like to say, the more they start clawing at their desk. This is not to say that their role in the government is not very important. They're the agency's watchdog. It is very important. It's just I have seen a trend over my career in them wanting to make cases at all costs and investigating matters that maybe go above and beyond the original allegations. And when the weight of the federal government, the investigative weight, puts that magnifying glass, that microscope on you, I'm here to tell you that none of us are perfect. So you want to make sure you take these investigations seriously and you get proper advice, and that may mean proper legal advice. It's important to be prepared for these types of investigations. At a minimum, just to understand what your rights are. Because while you're required as a federal employee to cooperate with every official investigation, not every request for an interview is mandatory. Some are voluntary, particularly if it involves the OIG. And sitting down for a voluntary interview is essentially a waiver of your Fifth Amendment right to silence, which is something that should never be done without talking to an attorney first. So if you are the subject of an investigation, it's just some things you want to know, you need to find out. And if you have an attorney, if you have the liability insurance, if you're a member of AFSA, these are all things that they're going to find out for you. You're going to want to know, are you the subject of the investigation? Are you a subject or are you a witness? You're going to want to know, is the request to be interviewed voluntary or compelled? Voluntary or compelled. This is the difference between what we call a Garrity and a Calkins interview warning. Garrity is a voluntary one. Calkins one is required. Okay? A Calkins warning, a compelled interview, means that you have to sit down and give the testimony. You cannot refuse. If you refuse, you can be disciplined, including removal from federal service. What the compelled type warning investigation does get you, however, I should mention we want all these interviews to be compelled because that gets you use immunity, meaning everything you say in that investigation cannot be used against you in a criminal matter unless you lie to them in that underlying investigation. Okay? Voluntary, compelled. Sitting down for a voluntary interview is a waiver of your Fifth Amendment right. Anything you say can be used against you. If it's voluntary, I recommend that you absolutely get legal advice before you sit down for a voluntary interview. Can these investigations lead to disciplinary or other personnel actions against you? Heck yes. That's the whole reason, that's one of the main reasons that they are doing it. So these concepts, while they look fairly simple, are you a subject or a witness? Is it voluntary or compelled? The investigative entities tend to blend these. You're worried about witness today, subject tomorrow, and then the voluntary compelled distinctions that we will see out there is they won't answer the question. They'll just say you're required to cooperate with the investigation. Well, I know I'm required to cooperate with the investigation, but is the interview a voluntary one or a compelled one? And you're a lot better off if you have an attorney or your representative asking these questions, because they can also try to find out a little bit more about what the allegations are. If you're interested, I have some witness interview tips that I can provide you after the webcast. If you just email us, we'll be happy to send that out to anybody who wants them. Congressional inquiries are another type of investigation that you could be subjected to. It could come in a form of an informal, usually starts with an informal request for testimony as opposed to a formal subpoena. But if that's refused, it can move to a formal subpoena, and the Fed's policy will provide legal representation if you are the target of a congressional investigation. And folks, you know it more than I do, often it's the career official that gets served up by the politicals to go up on Capitol Hill to testify about something that's politically charged that they're hot about. So it's good to have your own legal representation during situations like that. It also covers commissions, legislative commissions, such as 9/11 Commission. You know, if you were a member, if you were involved in that, you would, and had a feds policy, you would have been provided your own attorney throughout that type of investigation. A final kind of investigation I want to talk about are EEO complaints, and I'll probably should throw out here, OSC, Office of Special Counsel investigations, whistleblower reprisal, investigations into prohibited personnel practices. When I talk about these subjects in EEO, I'm often asked, you know, why do I need liability and protection for these types of complaints? Isn't it a complaint against the agency? I know I'm the responsible management official, but isn't the civil case against the agency? And isn't the agency required to defend that EEO or other civil case? The answer to that is yes. It is a case to the agency, against the agency, and while you do have immunity against those types of cases, the agency lawyers who are defending the case, their duty of loyalty is to the agency. Their client's the agency, not you. Their duty of loyalty is not to you. So there have been occasions where we've seen them advancing an interest that's adverse to yours. So it's important to at least have your own legal counsel during these phases because, again, it's good to have an attorney or representative that's got solely your interest at heart. Your interest, duty of loyalty is to you personally, so they're providing advice to you along those lines. Moreover, I've really found that in EEO cases, whistleblower reprisal, other types of OSC investigations, nobody's really explaining to the manager involved what their role is in the process, okay? Particularly in EEO cases, all you know is an EEO investigator shows up at your doorstep, says somebody's accused you of discrimination and I need an affidavit. The important part of that process is that affidavit, creating that affidavit, that's going to be what's called the legitimate non-discriminatory reason for the agency doing what it did or did not do to that employee. And it's your requirement to establish that as a manager. And you want to establish that like they vote in Chicago, early and often. You know, you want to do it early in the stage so that you're not just developing it at the, you know, at the trial doorsteps. And that's going to be the piece of evidence that the agency uses to defend against the EEO case. So while your interests are aligned with the agency counsel usually, we want to make sure that we're helping them as much as we can, we're giving them the evidence that they need, and we want to make sure that your interests are being looked out for as well. The reason we cover these is because if there is a negative finding in any of these cases, it could then result in an investigation against you and possibly a disciplinary action. Finally, I want to talk about your criminal exposure. I know none of you dedicated civil servants came to work today to commit a federal crime, but as federal officials, you need to appreciate that there is very little you can do wrong in the federal government and not have it also be a violation of Title 18, which is the criminal code. Some of the most common criminal investigations involving federal employees involve conflict of interest statutes where intent is not a prerequisite to prove the crime, misappropriation of federal funds, release of Privacy Act or other statutorily protected information, you know, anything, any situation arising out of an allegation of misuse or abuse of your position or authority. I actually, last year at my law firm, before I left, found feds, I actually represented a USAID senior official who was accused of one of these conflicts of interest, you know, criminal violations involving a contract that was awarded where it was alleged that he had a family member who apparently worked for the company that was awarded the contract. So again, intent. He didn't even know, but intent is not an element, of that crime. And the IG, any investigation involving the IG, always typically starts off criminal. They are criminal investigators, 1811s, criminal investigators first. So they're always going to evaluate that first. And so if you are notified that you are a subject of a criminal investigation, it is absolutely important for you to talk to or retain a criminal defense attorney before you talk to anyone. You can't, if you are a subject of a real-world criminal investigation, you do not have the luxury to sit around and wait for an indictment as a federal official. Once the indictment hits, it's game over. So you really need to have your own criminal defense counsel in there working to get what's called a declination of prosecution. So this is just a quick recap on what the Fed's policy covers. I do want to emphasize one point here that I don't think I mentioned earlier. In order for the policy to apply, you must be rendering professional service. Okay? That's a fancy phrase for you must be doing your job. It must involve you doing your job, not something off-duty, moonlighting. The favorite example I like to give is the FBI agent who got busted for shoplifting at Costco because he's in line. Okay? That's not part of his job. He's not covered. There's a nexus to his federal employment. He's going to lose his job, but he wasn't rendering a professional service, so the liability insurance doesn't apply to them. Or the Secret Service agents who recently got caught with the prostitutes down in Colombia, off-duty, prostitution, not rendering a professional service, therefore you're not covered. So this is what the policy covers. Some other important policy features that I would like to mention is the policy covers you, particularly since we're talking to USAID folks, the policy covers you anywhere in the world, anywhere where you're assigned outside of the CONUS, and it does so at no additional cost, unlike some of the other policies that are out there. The policy also provides 2 free legal consultations for pre-complaint matters. This is annually. Or other matters outside the scope of the coverage, again, at no additional cost. Like some of the other policies out there will charge extra for this. There are no deductibles. Our benefits are secured by a U.S.-based insurance company with an AM Best financial strength rating of A. And finally, the policy provides you with a free 3-year tail for civil suits after you leave federal service. So as long as you have the policy on the date that you retire, congratulations, you get 3 years of free coverage. You don't have to buy the insurance again. You're covered for 3 years, 36 months, which is a standard statute of limitations for anybody to file a federal civil lawsuit against you. I should just mention, I've been defending federal employees for many years, my whole career, almost 20 years now. I really founded feds to protect hardworking civil servants like yourselves. Whether the complaint comes from a member of the public, special interest group, industry, politically motivated, subordinate employees, whoever. The thought that an investigation requiring legal counsel could never happen to you is pretty naive. If you don't have liability coverage in place, you become the target of one of these allegations, and you need an attorney experienced in federal law. Even if you're ultimately vindicated, with hourly rates running, $300 to $400 an hour, these costs will add up very, very quickly. Okay, and you don't have to break the piggy bank to get the insurance. The coverage is $290 for the $1 million, $390 for the $2 million. It's as low as $145 if you're eligible for the reimbursement. Managers, supervisors, law enforcement officers, contracting officers who file financial disclosure forms. Again, PLI is available to all federal employees, not just these groups. It's just that Congress has identified them as having the most exposure, so they're up they're entitled to the 50% reimbursement, or what's capped at USAID at 175. It's very affordable. Payroll deduction is available, starts at $12 a pay period. Again, with hourly rates running from $300 to $400 an hour for experienced lawyers, you will spend more for 1 hour of legal service than what the annual premium costs. When I was an attorney in private practice, I sadly witnessed people mortgaging their homes, depleting all of their TSP savings, simply because they didn't have a PLI policy in place. If you have any exposure at all, why would you risk it for $290? You wouldn't risk your house or your car for insurance premiums. Why would you risk your job? Can't emphasize this final point enough. The insurance needs to be in place before the claim happens. Okay, can't get your car insurance on Wednesday for an accident that happened on Monday. All right, if your house is already on fire, you're not going to be covered. You need to have the policy in place first. There are 3 real easy ways to get enrolled. It takes less than 5 minutes. The easiest, I think, is on our website. You can print your certificate of insurance right there. We can email you an enrollment form. It's only 1 page. You can fax it back in. You can mail it back in. You can pay by credit card online, pay by credit card on the form, pay by check. As I mentioned, payroll deduction is available for as low as $12 a pay period. Or if you like to just, one of those people who don't like to use computers for these things, you can just give us a call, and we'll be happy to get you enrolled over the phone and obviously answer any questions that you have as well. So that's all I had for today's discussion, and I want to thank everyone for attending, and I guess we'll open it up to any questions that you may have that I believe Kathy will facilitate for me.
If anyone has questions, in your control panel, there's an area that says questions. If you click on that plus, it'll expand the box so that you can type in your question, or you can raise your hand if you have a question. Tony, I'm going to unmute someone so they can ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Can you hear us? Okay, Tony, sorry about that. It must not be working properly. I'm going to unmute someone else.
I thought I heard them, but...
Should I repeat that? Yes.
Yes, I didn't hear the question. Go ahead and repeat it.
Okay.
Yes.
If you can't hear me, just let me know. I'll repeat it again. So myself and some other colleagues, we operate in what would be defined as a restrictive environment. So we're funding individuals and organizations abroad. And what I'd like to know is, what is the potential liability in terms of if something happens to those individuals, particularly individuals in a target country that, if they're arrested or, something happens to them where they experience some sort of repression, what is our liability on our end?
On a couple different levels, and again, this is going to involve, some complicated diplomatic immunity stuff. If the locals were trying to do something for any liability that was created that flowed from money or instruments that you provided. But let me back up before that, because I see this all the time. Because the biggest vulnerability sometimes I see in situations like that is you're given certain instructions to provide X to do Y, and you're standing these these offices, portfolios, whatever you want to call them, up in new areas and things like that, and sometimes you don't get, all the clear direction that you're supposed to get in writing, and it's kind of just understood, here's what you're going to do, and then a new management team comes in, and they've got a different way of doing stuff, and then it results in investigations of how you awarded those funds, why you awarded those funds, and things like that. So any investigation flowing out of that would be covered, for example, from an administrative investigative aspect. The question I think you were asking is a lawsuit that would come from the other side of it. You would be protected. An unclassified now example that I can give that maybe you can resonate with the type of question you're asking. Do you remember the workers in Peru who were shot down by the CIA, the aid workers, and the CIA shot them about 10 years ago? They mistakenly identified them, the aid workers, as being bad guys, and they shot them down. That resulted in civil lawsuits. Policy comes in and provides legal defense for that types of lawsuit. Would have actually provided indemnity protection if there was a judgment against those CIA officials who ordered the plane to be shot down. It resulted in a multitude of IG, internal agency investigations, and they all had their own lawyers for all those investigations. So if you're being sued, if you're going to be sued personally that flows out of some decisions that you made, you would be protected. But the other concept that's going to come into play, is there's going to be diplomatic immunity that's going to be asserted. But the larger kind of the political implications, it remains to be seen whether the government will assert that diplomatic immunity for you. So I'm not sure if I answered your question. You still there? Is he unmuted now, Kathy?
Hold on.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I think you sort of answered the question. It might require some additional follow-up sort of on a one-on-one basis, if that's possible.
Yeah, that might be. If you want to call the office, I'm happy, to get in a little bit more specifics. But the bottom line is any sort of lawsuit against you personally that flows out of acts, error, or omissions that you made, part of your federal official responsibilities, job duties, you are going to be covered. I tend to complicate things because I'm a lawyer. We always do that. I just try to practically explain what's going to happen. We're going to point to these other things first because we want to get you absolute immunity if we can and not have to fight the qualified immunity. So if I can pull in the Federal Tort Claims Act, we are. If I can pull in diplomatic immunity, we are, or do all those things. But the whole idea for the insurance is when all these other protections fall apart, we want you to be able, because it's a possibility that it can happen, we want you to be protected. And I thought that the CIA one was a good example.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy, you probably want to mute that again.
It is. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties, and seems to be our last question, Tony.
Okay. Well, again, I thank you all. And if you have any follow-up questions or I want to chat about anything one-on-one with me, I'm available all week. Just shoot us an email or give us a call, and we'll schedule something. Thank you.